Good afternoon. I'm Mireya Janow, and it's my great privilege to moderate this afternoon's discussion. Let me just say a word of appreciation for Hugh Patrick and the Center on Japanese Economy and Business. I joined Columbia University over 20 years ago out of government service at USTR, in no small part because of Professor Hugh Patrick and Professor Gerald Curtis. So I'm deeply grateful for the existence of the Center on Japanese Economy and Business. I've been affiliated with it since I joined Columbia. And I do think one of the really wonderful defining strengths of Columbia at its best is our interdisciplinary approach to thinking about problems in the world and our ability to work across schools collaboratively. I'm now Dean of SEPA, and we work very closely with the business school and share faculty and students and collaborations on research and many things. So it's also a great privilege to be here with Dean Hubbard. And I really appreciated his remarks. So we have with us today 4 leading experts in international trade, economics, and policy who will bring different and I think important dimensions to our discussion of international trade today. You have their backgrounds, and so I will be very brief in my introduction. Dr. Solís is director of the Center for East Asian Studies and the Knight Professor in Japanese Studies at the Brookings Institution. She's written a number of important books and articles, including a recent book on Japan, Dilemmas of a Trading Nation, that won the 2018 Ohira Memorial Award. Congratulations. Ambassador Oshima is currently chairman of the Institute for International Economic Studies, and as you know, has had a remarkable and distinguished career in the foreign ministry. He was a lead negotiator and coordinator for TPP, ambassador to the WTO, to other countries, a member of the appellate body, lead Sherpa for past G8 summits, is a true expert in international trade, and is an adjunct professor at the National Institute for Policy Studies. Professor Caliendo is professor of economics at Yale School of Management, and he's done very important and influential work on trade and wage structure of firms, which I hope he will speak to a bit today. And of course, Professor Weinstein needs no introduction, but let me just say my distinguished colleague at Columbia University has a former chair of the economics department and a longtime leadership role at CJEB as director of research, has also very well known as a trade economist and doing work at the New York Fed and with the Fed Board of Governors. And his recent work on trade effects of the tariffs, I think, are helping to shape and inform the debate and understanding in the United States today about the effects of these tariffs. So let me just get us started by offering a few contextual remarks about this moment that we are in. And I find myself in perhaps too strong agreement with the observations of Dean Hubbard. I say too strong because there's would seem to be a collaboration that has not occurred actually in preparation. But as I think about the moment that we're in, I'd like to just offer a thought or two on how do we think about this moment in the sweep of U.S. history of trade policy, in U.S.-China and U.S.-Japan negotiations, and the future of multilateralism. I think these are all themes that this panel must engage to consider the moment that we are in. And I have asked myself, how unusual is this period in U.S. trade policy? And it has taken me back to the work of economic historians and trade historians, and I think many have noted that trade has been a source of political conflict in the United States throughout our history. And that if you look at the broad sweep of U.S. economic history, trade policy has been an instrument to raise revenues for the government, to restrict imports, and as an instrument of concluding reciprocity agreements. And this revenue restriction and reciprocity purpose of trade, I think, has really been defining at different periods since the formation of the United States, and it took big shifts to shift from one policy to another. I agree with those who see that we are still in the third phase of reciprocity, which has been characterized as much by bilateralism and in certain periods by multilateralism, and the latter have been launched when protectionism is seen as rising, at least historically in the 70s and 80s. So looking at the current period, it doesn't feel wholly unfamiliar to my own experiences in the late 80s and 90s in the sense of aggressive use of trade tools. But what is different is that that earlier period of bilateralism, especially with Japan, was framed in the context of also strengthening multilateralism. And that is what we are not seeing today in this use of bilateral tools. And I think the reasons for that are many. And some of the reasons I would point to are the same that Dean Hubbard spoke to. Disillusion with multilateralism, the sense that it's stalled, the pressures of globalization and technological change, the economic role of China. These are among factors I would point to. And I think whether President Trump got his own agenda, and he clearly does, some of the issues that he is taking on, I think any US president would take on. And then there are features which are very particular to this administration. I hope our discussion as we talk about Japan might also think about how the US-Japan negotiations might be influenced by what has already been negotiated between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, because it offers some signal on how it might affect the bilateral negotiations. And I would summarize my assessment of that framework as maybe 40% NAFTA, 40% TPP, and 20% very uniquely defining features of this administration, at those unique features being domestic content, investor state, and currency-related provisions. The US-China negotiation is very significant to me because it goes well beyond trade and is, in fact, a recalibration in many important respects of the US-China relationship, where I think the sense of strategic rivalry has become so very profound. And of course, all of these dimensions have important implications for the future of the WTO and multilateralism. And as a former member of the appellate body, it is a moment, I think, of crisis at the WTO, nothing short of that, where, again, agreeing with earlier remarks, it's a time when countries need to come together and revisit and remind why the multilateral system is important and what can be done to strengthen it, whether that means reforming those features, both easy and hard, and also looking to the future. I think these are some of the challenges posed by the moment that we are in international trade, and which I'm sure my distinguished colleagues will offer some important perspective. So with that, by way of a brief introduction, let me invite Dr. Solís to take us forward.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank Columbia Business School and the Center of Japanese Economy and Business and the Development Bank of Japan for inviting me to this very important event. It's a distinct pleasure to be in the same panel as Professor Weinstein, who sat in my dissertation committee and provided a lot of wise advice, for which I'm forever grateful. So let me just start with a brief statement, and that is that the architects of the multilateral trading system vowed to leave behind an era where economic nationalism and tit-for-tat trade wars undercut growth and fostered interstate frictions. I think that today we're openly asking the question as to whether that past will be our present and our future. So I cannot think of a more important topic to be addressing that, the one we're addressing this afternoon. I have limited time, so I'm going to try to do three things as I go with my remarks. One is to sketch some of the factors that I consider very important in understanding where is this new protectionism coming from. Two, to address what I think are the consequences of mistakes and errors, an inward turn, if you will, in American trade policy that is undermining American influence in Asia. And then to finally to share with all of you my assessment of what I think are the prospects for the Japan-US bilateral trade negotiations, where I see there's great potential to build on the partnership if we navigate those negotiations to safe harbor, and that's not going to be an easy task. So then let me start with what is fueling this new protectionism. I would like to offer three main factors. One is a decay of multilateralism, and I know that Ambassador Oshima will touch on that in much more detail. So I'll just very briefly mention some of the troubling trends. And that is that since the onset of the World Trade Organization, unfortunately, it has not been possible to update trade and investment rules at the multilateral level in any significant way. The Doha round is effectively dead, and we therefore have found ourselves with a multilateral voting system that faces a stagnation, deadlock in the negotiation process. Add to that now a more complicated picture when it comes to the other very important function of the WTO, and that is enforcement, to make sure that the trade rules are respected and countries abide by them. You need a healthy trade adjudication mechanism. Unfortunately, the prospect there is not very bright. At the end of this year, it could be that there are not enough members in the appellate body to hear cases, and that again will create a very complicated picture if you have a WTO body that does not generate new rules and cannot enforce existing ones. That has to be, I think, an important background to all the other developments that we're going to be discussing today. The second major driver of the new protectionism I would broadly call the China challenge. And by this I mean the distortions and externalities generated by China's recommitment to its state capitalism model in the post-WTO accession years. Market distorting policies of concern have already been mentioned. Let me just again allude to them. Intellectual property theft, over-subsidization that generates excess capacity, unfair advantages to state-owned enterprises, forced technology transfers, and digital protectionism. Now, I just arrived from Washington, and I think it comes as no surprise when I tell you that views on China in Washington have hardened, and they have hardened very quickly. Just 2.5 years ago, when we were in the middle of the presidential campaign season, there was a lot of debate on China, and that was mostly as part of the China trade shock, if you will. That's how it was characterized. And a lot of the discussion had to do as to how imports from China were eliminating factory jobs in the United States. I think those concerns remain, even though we understand that technological change is a much larger force. Nevertheless, those concerns remain, but the focus of the conversation in Washington and many other parts of the country has shifted, with now an added concern as to what is China doing with respect to its high-tech ambitions. And the China 2025 program has already been mentioned. The concern, I think, is that China may use its interventionist industrial policy to nurture the industries of the future. Artificial intelligence, smart manufacturing, and the Internet of Things, just to mention a few things. And the last element that I would bring up in discussing why are we so concerned about this rising protectionism has to do with the United States. And think about how significant it is that the chief architect of the post-war free trading system seems to be getting cold feet. And what we're seeing in the United States, especially with the Trump administration, is, I would argue, an inward turn. Now, the eroding consensus on supporting ambitious trade agreements in the American political system goes back decades. It is the result of a domestic viability problem due to the lack of investments in workforce development and a safety net to cope with economic change, just as Dean Hubbard explained in much better ways. But I would argue that President Trump did bring about a major restructuring, a drastic restructuring in U.S. trade policy because of the views he holds of trade as essentially a zero-sum competition with one way in which you keep scorecard, and that is the bilateral trade balance. Now, the defining test, as I see it, for Trump's America First trade policy will be the China challenge. And I think that true to the spirit of his trade philosophy, the Trump administration has decided to go it alone in trying to compel China to change its economic practices. We've seen tariffs go up very quickly. We've also seen intense negotiations between China and the United States. At some point, it looked like they were close to some kind of deal, and then things fell apart, and we've seen a deterioration, a worsening outlook for the economic conflict. And I think we can all assume that the U.S.-China economic rivalry is going to be with us for a long time. But the Trump administration has closed and opened many other trade fronts with very important implications for America's standing and influence in the region. Let me allude to those elements very quickly. And it's actually with a lot of regret that I say this, but I think that the United States has committed two major own goals, and we may be on the cusp of committing a third one when we think about trade initiatives. What are these own goals? First and foremost, the decision to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Initiative. I think that these created a huge credibility blow for the United States, the first time that the country withdraws from a signed trade agreement, which was essential for the United States to be the driving force behind the standards and rules that would drive economic integration in the region. I also think it created a lot of disadvantages for American producers who now find themselves looking from the outside in and trying to not lose significant market share. We already know the figures about how American beef producers, for example, are losing important market share in the Japanese market. Second own goal, I think it's the use of bogus national security tariffs against your own allies. I think that what that does is that it creates a lot of friction with our closest partners, with our closest allies. And the only way you can begin to address the China challenge is if you work in coordination with others. It will require a multidimensional and multilateral solution to begin to unravel that important problem. And we know that a year ago, when the Trump administration imposed the national security tariff on metal and metals, it created a lot of friction with the European Union, with Mexico, with Canada, and other countries. But this will pale in comparison if the administration were to decide to go forward with national security tariffs on automobiles. The economic harm would be much larger, and so would be the fallout with our closest partners. Now, I see a potential third own goal in the making, and that is if negotiations with Japan were to be mismanaged, I think this would be another important mistake. Certainly hope we don't go there. So let me then turn to the last element of my remarks today and talk a little bit about the prospects for the U.S.-Japan bilateral trade talks. First of all, do not expect a replay of TTP negotiation dynamics. Even though Japan and the United States were at the table just a few years ago as part of this negotiation exercise, the world has profoundly changed. And therefore, we cannot expect a repeat of that exercise. It now seems ancient history, but the US government at some point was still a strong believer in multilateral trade deals, trying to secure ambitious mega trade agreements across the Atlantic and across the Pacific. And at the same time, it was Japan, the one country that came last into the TPP. You remember those discussions back then. There was real concern that Japan, because of its own domestic political constraints, will miss the boat, will remain outside of the TPP, and the cost that that would represent for Japan. Think how much the world has changed. We're in completely opposite places today. Japan actually has shown great trade leadership and was able to rescue the Trans-Pacific Partnership with the other 10 countries, and was also able to secure an agreement with the European Union. Both trade agreements have now gone into effect, and they are indeed putting American producers at a disadvantage because of the decision of the Trump administration, particularly when it comes to exiting the TPP. The direction of U.S. trade policy in the past 2 years could not be more different. You have the American president saying that he does not believe in multilateralism, only bilaterals will do, and he's using the tariff to try to protect sectors, to try to get a leverage in trade negotiations. I think that if you want to understand the philosophy behind Trump's approach to trade, it's very simple. Just look up his tweet, the tariff man tweet, and that tells you exactly what he believes on. Zero-sum competition, and we win if we impose tariffs. I disagree with those, with the underlying assumptions of that philosophy, but I think that's what's driving American trade policy. So because these two countries are now in very different places, I think that these bilateral negotiations are going to be very tricky. And the differences are already apparent even when both leaders from Japan and the United States are trying to put a brave face and are trying to get these negotiations to a successful conclusion. If you look at the joint statement by the two leaders of back September past, you can begin to see the differences. President Trump referenced his single most important goal is to reduce the trade deficit with Japan. Prime Minister Abe alluded to the importance of rules-based trade. There's also an ongoing disagreement on what is the right acronym to use for this negotiation, and it's not about semantics, whether it should be an FTA or whether it should be a trade in goods. It actually has to do with major differences on what is the right scope of the negotiations, and I think it's concern about the new rules that the Trump administration wants to bring to these trade agreements on currency manipulation, on non-market economy trade agreements, and so forth. Now, I would also argue that these negotiations are going to be very different, because if you think about what is the most urgent factor that is bringing both countries to the negotiation table, it is something that was non-existing at the time of the TPP talks. What I have in mind here is that, in my mind, the most important objective of Japan in agreeing to these bilateral trade talks is to deflect U.S. unilateralism. And Japan agreed to come to the table in order to avoid the imposition of a 25% national security tariff on automobiles. For the United States, I think the most important objective is to play catch-up with Japan's trade leadership. The fact that Japan was able to mobilize other countries in support of rules-based trade, make the TPP live to see another day, I think that that is creating a lot of concern in American agricultural circles, and therefore the president wants results, and he wants them fast. Now, why this could be a non-self goal? Well, I think that there are potential pitfalls in the negotiations, things that hopefully the American side will avoid, and that would be to frame the negotiations as one-sided concessions from Japan on agriculture, to revert to managed trade practices of the past, demanding an export restraint on automobiles, and of course, if national security tariffs in automobiles were to be applied. For that reason, I find it very concerning that just 2 weeks ago, the Trump administration issued an executive declaration, a proclamation on adjusting auto imports, where for the first time a distinction was made between foreign-owned and domestic-owned enterprises, and in a way discounting the benefits of very significant Japanese investments in the United States. And I can get into the detail of all of that since I'm about to run out of time. But let me say the following in closing. A lot is at stake here. Bilateral trade negotiations between Japan and the United States can be dead weight if we end up having a very protracted negotiation with acrimony over quotas and tariffs. or they could be a stepping stone toward coordinated economic statecraft, because Japan and the United States share fundamental interests when it comes to advancing rules on the digital economy, with codifying rules that address the distortions of state capitalism, and also in supplying infrastructure finance to developing Asia to make sure that different countries in the region have alternatives and that you promote a race to the top on connectivity standards. Let's not lose sight of how robust U.S. Japan economic and interests are and how much they can do together, and these trade negotiations should be no distraction from that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's a perfect segue for Ambassador Oshima.
Thank you, Merit. Thank you so much for the Colombia people for inviting me to this very interesting seminar. First and foremost, let me just start by referring to my Colombia experience. I never had the benefit of going to Colombia, graduating, but my first experience with any American college campus was Colombia. I went to the United States in 1953, and because my father had a job in New York, and I started by taking English lessons at the Columbia campus. So I know that if you see the statute, Minerva statute, there's an owl in the hidden in the what do you call it in the skirts of the Minerva statute. Anyway, that's my Colombia, my only Colombia experience. すみません、今日のインターベンションは日本語でさせていただきたいと思います。そして先ほど来のいろいろな発言、ハーバード先生、ジェイノ先生、今のソリス先生の発言とほぼかなりのところでダブる話ですが、私はちょっとその長年貿易問題に変わってきたこともあるので、少しその歴史的な視点で今何が起こっているかを見直してみて、それが我々にどういう話を示すかということにしたいと思います。したがって多くの部分は、老人の繰り言みたいなところがありますが、お許しください。まずこれすでに言われていることだと思いますけれども、現在 WTO を中心とする国際秩序体制を大きく動揺しています。かなりの部分がアメリカのトランプ政権のせいだと言われているけれども、これは実は昔から少しかなり前から動揺しているので、全てをアメリカのせいに帰すことはできないと思います。で、先ほどハバード先生もおっしゃってますけれども、私も現在の、私はこれアメリカとしてますけれども、世界的ないろいろな貿易問題に対する反応の背後にグローバリゼーションの負の側面というのがあると思います。で、したがって、そういった問題を意識しながら歴史的な振り返ってみたいと思います。そもそも WTO というのはご承知の通りガットから発展したわけです。で、ガットがどういうものであったかというのはすでにご承知だと思いますけれども、自由化というのが大事だと思います。国内の自由化と国際的な自由化を同時に達成するということが理念としてあったと思います。で、それが実際に数次にわたる貿易自由化交渉、関税引き下げですけれども、ラウンド交渉を行ってきたと。ケンディーランドや東京ランドは有名ですけれども、それが積もり積もっていよいよ最後にウルグアイラウンドとしてガットが WTO に発展的になっていったということはご承知の通りです。で、ガットの枠の中で世界で最も恩恵を享受したのはおそらく日本だろうと私は思います。で、これをグラフを見ていただくと分かりますけれども、1965年ちょうど日本が経常収支が公示になったぐらいですけれども、その時の日本の GDP の世界における占める割合は 5%、80年には 10%、95年には 18%、こうやって全体の中のシェアが大きくなるにつれて構造的な変化を世界経済にもたらして、それが 日米の緊張になったことをいろいろすでに話されていることからもご承知だと思います。ちょうどその頃日米間の貿易摩擦が起こったと。で強いて言えばアメリカはさっきご説明ありましたけれども、私全く同感ですが、アメリカは日米をバイで扱うと同時にマルチでも扱っていたと。で日米のバイでは貿易摩擦となって日本のものの輸出を抑制する、あるいは日本のサービス産業を開放するということを追求した。で米国はものについては301というようなことで、制裁という言葉を使って日本の抑制を、輸出の抑制を図ってきたと。自動車の自主規制が有名な話ですけれども、それから同時にさらに構造改革として、いろんな名前をついた交渉をしましたけれども、モス協議とか SII 構造協議というのをやってきました。で日米間の摩擦のリストをここにあります。これ詳しすぎるのでこれ説明しませんけれども、だんだん年を追うにつれて話がより高度テクノロジーになっていったことが注目されるわけです。で同時にマルチではGATT の改革をアメリカは志しました。で日本とヨーロッパと語って質的にGATTを当時の世界経済の発展段階に応じた、高度化に応じたものにするという努力をして、それがウルグアイランドだったわけです。で日本はこちらの方には一緒にやって積極的に参画したのがご承知の通りです。したがってサービス分野の自由化などにも応じましたし、他方日本にとって重要だったのがアメリカがバイで日本にいろいろ迫る時に使った301条の制裁措置というのをできないようにしたと。ご承知の通り WTO の紛争解決制度の下では対抗措置というのは DS を使ってそれが違法であるとして相手国が負けた方が動かないときに使えるという限定的になっていますので、そういった形で日本は301条が日本に対して恣意的に使われることないようにしたわけです。でそのウルグアイランドが止まってきて終わって WTO が95年の1月1日に発足しました。で WTO を見てみますと、もうすでにご承知の通り GATT よりも内容も深く参画も広いわけです。でただし基本的な枠組みは全く変わりません。無差別原則、内国民待遇、最恵国待遇、こういったところが一番基本です。しかし範囲が広いという意味では GATS、サービス産業を扱った GATS、あるいは知的所有権に関わる貿易問題を使った Tariffs、さらに紛争解決を扱った DSU、こういうのがあって WTO は GATT よりもはるかに強化されました。ところが同時にそういった大きな仕組みにするために途上国がいろいろ容易でないということで抵抗したのを防ぐために、そういうのを防ぐために一般貿易ルールの中に農業を加えました。それまで農業は同じものの中でも入っていなかったのをご承知だと思います。で日本はその時お米の輸入を受け入れて、関税化をしたわけです。さらに、日本はその頃すでに繊維貿易は日本のあれではメインではなかったですけれども、途上国は当然重要だったので、アメリカヨーロッパにおけるクオータというのが制限要因になっていた。これをいずれ撤廃するということを条件として途上国も WTO の仕組みに参加するということを確保したわけです。大きな取引グランドディールと言ってもいいかもしれません。で WTO の成功についてはすでに皆さんご承知の通り、市場開放がさらに進み世界経済が途上国も含めて発展していったと。でいろんなエンフォースメント履行は紛争解決制度で確保されていったということです。それで2001年に、今まで新しく2001年にドーハで閣僚会議を開いたときに2つ大きなことが起こりました。一つはドーハランドを立ち上げると。でもう一つは中国の WTO 加盟を容認するということです。しかし先ほど来ご説明がありましたように、ドーハランドは2008年には頓挫したと言えると思います。でなぜそうなったかというと、いろんな説はありますけど、私はやっぱり新興国を中心とした途上国がすでに WTO で利益を得ているので、これ以上自由化する義務を負いたくないといったところが大きかったと思います。 で他方中国が WTO に入って今度は GATT における日本のように中国が WTO で最大の恩恵を受けたのではないかと言えるかと思いますが、このグラフを見ていただくとちょっと面白いと私は思っております。上が先ほどお見せした日本のその経済規模が大きくなっていく円グラフですけれども、下は中国の経済が全体の中で大きくなっていく円グラフです。95年は中国は 2.4% ですが、10年には 9%、18年には 16%、これはドルベースですけれども、で30年目の見通しとしては 19% になると、ちょうど日本がグローバルの割合をどんどん大きくしていったと同じような感じで中国が大きくなっていくと、当然そこに緊張が生ずるということだと思います。でそれで振り返って WTO が今どういう問題を抱えているかと見ますと、まず価値観を共有する国の組織だった GATT からより普遍的な国際組織になりました。加盟国も一層広くなって、サウジアラビア、ウクライナ、ロシア、ベトナムといったような国も入っています。したがって加盟国が増えたので数的には普遍的になった、インクルーシブという時に数的に言えば普遍的になったんですけれども、本当の意味でのインクルーシブというのはここでは市場経済主義が強くなったかどうかだと思いますけれども、実際は希薄になっているということは言えます。それでしたがってドーハラウンドが動かなくなってしまったので、世界経済はその間どんどん構造的に複雑になって発展しているにもかかわらず、 WTO としては自由化とか新分野のルールについて何ら義務を果たしてない、責務を果たしてない、つまり革新的にも果たしてないと思います。で他の国もみんなそう思っているがゆえに WTO そのものに対する信任が減ってきていると。で例えば一番いい例はGATT は交渉ラウンド何回行ってますけれども、 WTO は今のところ20年間ゼロです。GATT はリビングアグリーメント、常にその状況に応じて生きて変わっていくということが言われてましたが、そうであれば WTO は何かというと、よく言ってハイバネーティングではないかと、冬眠しているのではないかと思います。でここを起こしてあげないといけないというのがこれからの課題だと思います。一つちょっと横にずれますけれども TPP11 ですけれども、これは一応 WTO が動かないので一部の国が集まって WTO プラス、つまり WTO がカバーしている分野でさらによく改善すると、あるいは外に WTO が扱ってないような投資とか電子商取引を扱うと、こういうことだろうと思います。でこれでいよいよ、じゃあこれから WTO どういう将来があるかというと、やはり WTO は本来の業務である常にその世界経済の変化に対応して新たな課題に取り組んでルールを作って世界経済のプレディクタビリティを増やしていくということだと思います。でそのことによって信任を高めることだと思います。で特にデジタル経済で、少なくともマルチできないんであれば WTO の枠内で有志国が集まってプルリでやっていくということが大事だろうと思います。で最後になりますけれども、ご承知の通り6月の末に東京サミット、大阪サミットが G20 が行われますけれども、ここでも WTO 改革は重要な課題になっていることは今までの発言の中からも出てきています。で特に電子商取引、デジタル経済の分野でいろんなことをやっていく、一つのアイデアとしてデータガバナンスを扱うような大阪トラックというイニシアチブを日本が推していますけれども、こういった形で新しい分野でのルールを作る方向に持っていくことが重要な課題だと思います。実際にどこまでいけるかというのは先ほど来のご説明にもありましたように、アメリカと中国の間の構造的な対立が根っこにあって、この両国が今後どういうふうに国際通商体制を持っていくか、そういうふうにかかってくるのかと思いますけれども、我々としては多角的貿易体制 WTO の改革を進めていくことが重要だろうと私は思っています。以上でございます。
Thank you very much, Ambassador Oshima. Professor Caliendo.
Thank you. I'm going to use the podium, if you don't mind.
Please.
That's fine. Hello. Okay. So thank you very much for the invitation to participate in such a distinguished panel.
I want to thank the Center of Japanese Economy and Business and the Development Bank of Japan. So what I'm going to be talking about today, it's about protectionism and industrial location. Unfortunately, not so much about wages, which is another part of my research agenda. So big picture, let me show you what we see in the data. This is over the last 40 to 50 years. This is the trade over GDP, namely import and exports over GDP in the world. And what the key thing that you observe there is that it has grown up by almost basically a double over the last 40 to 50 years. And this is a characteristic about many countries in the world. In fact, let me show you the US and Japan, which is in the next slide there. So the US is basically blue, Japan red. What you see in the case of the US, in the case of the US, it almost tripled the amount of trade over GDP. In the case of Japan, it has increased not as much as the same trend as in the world, not as much as in the US. It didn't double, but it went up by roughly 75%. Who was the one driving a lot of this trade over GDP in the world? Of course, was China. So the next picture, what it shows is China. Trade over GDP in China over the last 40 to 50 years, it went up by 7 times larger compared to the initial period. The bottom line that I want to say is that the world has become much more open over the last 40 to 50 years. This is not a new phenomenon. It has been going on over almost half of the last century. And this phenomenon has involved a reallocation of industries across the world. Firms moving to different countries to produce, to take advantage on either cheaper labor costs or other types of benefits. Now, openness has resulted in aggregate gains. This is related to what Dean Howard was saying before. It's easy to show, and I can give you a lot of studies that have actually showed that trade basically has developed in aggregate gains across countries. However, these gains also involve a lot of reallocation of resources within countries. Not everyone gains the same within countries. And in fact, one can actually point down to the effects of the China's trade road on manufacturing employment in the US. In fact, it has accelerated the fact that manufacturing employment in the US has went down as a consequence of this increase in China's exports. Because of this reallocation of resources, because the fact that not everyone has actually gained in the same way, is that you see, and basically the theme of this part of the conference, America and the new protectionism. In fact, if you look at the US, as a result, protectionism has materialized in the US. David Weinstein is going to talk more about this in the next talk, but of course, last year and even 2 weeks ago, what we saw, a spike in tariff that US has applied to China, a lot of uncertainty about how this is going to basically materialize in the future, and of course, some retaliation, which we're not expecting, from China raising tariffs to the US. So what are the effects? Can protectionism potentially bring industries back home, which is part of the rhetoric behind these basically changes in tariffs? How long it takes for production to relocate? It's not that easy to open a plant across countries. This takes time. Is the country better off? Even though we might observe firms coming back to your own country, is it the case that workers, consumers are better off from actually having access to more firms in your own country? And does it have distributional consequences? This is part of the main focus of my research, and part of the questions I'm going to try to basically answer as I go in this talk today, which is on preliminary work, and I'm going to be explaining all these issues. Now, so what are the reasons for trade protectionism? In fact, when you go back to Economics 101, exactly as Dean Howard was saying, right, there's like 2 key theoretical reasons why countries protect. One is this idea of terms of trade manipulation, this idea that basically by changing tariffs, you are basically distorting prices, local prices and foreign prices. You're affecting the price of imports and exports. Another reason to basically protect is this idea of political economy motives. Political economy motives. Basically, some industries have lobbying powers, industries, it could be workers, etc. And those industries and those agents have higher, if you want, bargaining power with the government that basically, as a consequence of that, tariffs actually might materialize. Now, those discussions, which are very prominent in the theoretical literature, are far away from the discussion that we see in the political arena with this idea that trade protection and potentially can bring jobs back. There's a lot of historical examples on this. I can give you a lot of quotes in the news, not only about today, but even back in the US many years ago. Theoretically, in the literature, there's not much done. And quantitatively, in terms of assessing these results, not much done. So what are the mechanisms by which, as you basically change trade policy, in principle will have effects on industrial reallocation? So the key mechanisms are the following: that profits, local profits across locations, are going to be influenced by this, by trade policy. When you're thinking about opening a plant in one particular country, you have to keep in mind that you're not going to only sell locally, but you're also going to sell globally. So if that's a country that is very close to the rest of the world, and actually there's a big barrier. Profits are going to be influenced by trade policy in that country. Of course, local factors and prices. If it is very costly to hire workers in that location, you might not actually open a plant. If you don't have capital structures in place, it's very difficult to open a plant, you won't actually move to that particular location. Protectionism can create incentives to relocate production. But it's easier for firms, as we know, to be located in places, as I was saying before, with abundant capital structures, with cheaper labor, or more flexible labor markets, or deeper integration to the value chain of the firm. Still, it might be the case that it's a location that is very difficult to export to the rest of the world, but I might as be located to a place which there's have a cheaper supplier of intermediate goods to my own production. However, relocating, as we know, it's costly. There's a lot of barriers to entry across different regions inside a country and, of course, across countries. It's also costly to build capital structures. You might wonder, and of course, it might be very easy today to enter to a city like Detroit because most of the buildings in Detroit are empty. However, it's very difficult to enter and open a plant close to Palo Alto and San Francisco, which most of that capital structure, right, is not abundant. In fact, it's very expensive. And it's costly for workers to switch across sectors and regions. Even though I might well decide to enter into a country, it's very costly for people to basically to hire workers in that location. So what do I do? So what do we do is a joint work with Fernando Parro. We basically develop tools to try to quantify all of these margins of adjustment when we're thinking about the effects of trade policy. There's more details about this type of research, but let me try to give you kind of a view of what we find when we try to think about what will be the effect of a change in trade policy as the one that we will actually be observing in the last year. So the key thing that we bring is new data. This is data from the OECD that basically shows the location of production across the globe. This is basically the share of total manufacturing plants in the world, total construction plants, wholesale plants, and service plants. Where are they located? And I'm giving you an example of countries. What you see in this picture is, surprising or not, 4.7% of total manufacturing plants in the world are located in the US, 6.5% located in China. Of course, once you weigh this by size, by employment size, most of them are located in China. But simply counting plants, what you see, those are the shares that are located across countries. Whereas the big share of plants are located in the US are going to be the service plants. Now, even within the US, it's very heterogeneous where are they located inside the country. This is a map of the US, and what it shows you darker is basically, in darker sides, are the states in the US where most manufacturing production is taking place in the year 2015, which is the latest data actually that we're available, that we have access to. And as you see there, you see the Midwest, quite prominent, California, Texas, in parts of Florida. So how would a change in trade policy might change this map of production across the globe? In the short run and in the long run, what are the consequences for workers in terms of aggregate and real wages and price indices from that change in trade policy? That's what I'm going to try to answer. In particular, I'm going to study an increase in tariffs on the US, moving from the average that they had, which is 3.5%, to 25%, which is basically the discussion that we were having lately. Unfortunately, what we won't see today in my results are what would happen if China retaliates. So think about this as an example, which is only the US increasing tariff to the 25%. Okay? And I'm going to present some preliminary results about this. And still, of course, there's much work to be done, and that's what we're doing now at this time. Literally, okay. So what do we find as a consequence of this increase in tariff? There was an increase in the mass of manufacturing firms in the US. In the short run, the effect, in terms of percentage points, we're talking about 0.61%. Roughly, there's an entry of 1,700 plants that enter into the US in the manufacturing sector as a consequence of raising basically tariffs. In the long run, this effect is larger. We're talking about an increase of 3.2%, roughly 8,000 new plants. But very heterogeneous effects across space. Turns out to be, and let me show you the picture, given that I don't have a lot of time. So this is the entry in the short run. What you see entry all across, and in particular in these states, which is the Midwest, you see entry of firms in the short run. But in the long run, because of spatial competition, now the states are going to be competing for where actually plants will be entering. Capital is not so much abundance, as we were saying before, across states. There's different labor market regulations and flexible labor markets across states. What would happen in the long run, quite interesting, well, the entry of plants in the Midwest, in fact, goes down. There's larger entry on plants in other states of the US. Contrary, maybe, to the view that potentially manufacturing is going to come back to those states in which we thought we had a comparative advantage in manufacturing. But manufacturing is very different compared to what it was 20 years ago. So that's one takeaway that we find. Very different effects in the short run and in the long run. While in fact we might see plants coming back, it is not obvious that they're going to come back to the places that you thought they're going to come back. That's the first takeaway. The second takeaway is, well, there's effects across countries in the globe. Given that I was in Japan, what I wanted to show the effect on Japan. The average effect on Japan is going to be a reduction of manufacturing plants in Japan. I have more information about other variables if you're actually more interested, and we can talk later. But the bottom line I want to emphasize is there's a positive relocation effect. Yes, for a bit large country like the US, if you basically increase protectionism, you might see plants coming back. However, this positive effect might not necessarily materialize in a reduction in the price index. It might not necessarily materialize in an increase in well-being. There's a reason why these plants are not producing in the US today. So let me show you this. This is the increase in the price index across location. What do we find is that overall prices are going to increase in every single state. And when you look at real wages, what do we find is that real wages are going to go down in most states in the US. In fact, what we find is that on average, right, US real wages will decline by 1.17%, and on average, price index will go up by 4.1%. Well, yes, you might think of it as a target bringing jobs back, potentially, by basically relocating production. This doesn't necessarily, and in fact we find, quantitatively it does not have a positive effect on real wages, and it would actually have a negative effect. It won't have a negative effect on prices. In fact, prices will go up. So bottom line, and given that I don't have more time, what we find is that protectionism is not the tool to redistribute the gains from trade. It might bring industries back, but it does not guarantee an increase in the standard of life. The increase in price index due to higher barriers may or may not offset these positive effects on relocation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks very much. It's a great honor to be here again and present. This is some work that was done with Mary Miti at the Federal Reserve Bank and Steve Redding at Princeton. And I just want to emphasize what I'm going to say represents my views and not necessarily those views of my co-authors or the Federal Reserve Bank of Federal Reserve Bank. So I want to spend today just talking about what has happened in 2018 and 2019 and what the economic consequences of that has been for the United States. So in 2018, the U.S. imposed about 6 waves of tariffs, starting in February with tariffs on washing machines and solar panels. Then in April, they began 2 rounds of tariffs on steel and aluminum, followed by 3 waves of tariffs on China, culminating in September with a wave on about 10% tariffs on $200 billion worth of imports from China. And that those $200 billion have now been hit with a 4th wave, taking those tariffs to 25%. In terms of the impact, it's been quite substantial. So this plot shows average U.S. import tariffs into the United States. And as you can see, it was on a general downward trend. Tariff rates were quite low. Trade policy, I apologize to the other trade policy experts here, but it was kind of getting boring. And then suddenly we had Donald Trump come into the presidency. And you can see there was a fairly substantial change, and this chart doesn't even include the tariffs that were just imposed a couple of weeks ago. So basically, we've reversed about 25 years, or maybe actually with the latest round, probably 40, 50 years of trade liberalization. One thing that's not talked about very much has been foreign retaliation. So we've imposed tariffs on about 13% of U.S. imports, about $283 billion worth of imports. But foreign countries have retaliated on about $150 billion worth of our exports. And the countries that have retaliated include many of our closest allies, including Canada, Mexico, the EU, et cetera, as well as obviously China and other countries. So there's been a fairly substantial escalation in this trade war, and so you may wonder what has been the impact. And so I've done a couple of studies on this, to estimate how much this has been costing U.S. households. You can see, first off, that these impacts are really having substantial impacts on global supply chains. This is a plot showing global U.S. soybean exports. And you can see in the first plot, which is the first bar, which is for 2017, before the tariffs were imposed, most of U.S. soybean exports were to China. And then in 2018, after China retaliated against U.S. soybeans, basically U.S. exports to China went to zero. There's some residual exports from the first part of the year. And there was a fairly big expansion of U.S. exports to other countries. But importantly, what you can see from this plot is aggregate exports have fallen, right? And so part of what's going on is that supply chains are reorienting, but there was a reason why the U.S. was exporting to China, not China wasn't getting exports from or imports from other countries, and that was because the U.S. was the low-cost supplier. So as these supply chains are reorienting, costs are going up, and when costs go up, you get less trade. And I'm gonna kind of move along that theme in a few slides to kind of show you what those costs are. If we look at what's been happening to U.S. trade patterns, we're seeing just a tremendous reorientation in U.S. Trade patterns. In our work, we've estimated that it's about $165 billion worth of trade. This is imports and exports that are being reoriented as a result of this. And here you can see this in a couple of plots. The orange solid line corresponds to U.S. Total imports from China, which in the first quarter of 2018 were growing at about 14% per year. That's now fallen to about 3% per year. But U.S. exports to China have fallen even faster. They were growing at about 9% per year, as you can see in the blue line, and those are now at minus 31%. So basically, trade with China has fallen dramatically. Trade with the rest, exports to the rest of the world have been roughly flat. So what we're seeing is that there's a big change in U.S. trade patterns that are as a result of both U.S. tariffs and the retaliation against tariffs. So why does this matter, right? So economists think about the costs in two ways. We think about costs of paying additional taxes on imports, and then efficiency costs. And I just want to give a very simple example of why protection can be costly. You know, imagine you're buying a good from China, and we'll start in free trade, which is the first column in this chart, and imagine that good costs $100. From China, and that there's a Vietnamese supplier that's supplying the same good for 120 into the U.S. market. So the cheapest supplier in that case would be would be China. Got it right on the third time. And the US importer would pay $100 for that good, and the government would collect no tariff revenue. Now imagine you impose a 5% tariff, and suppose that whoever is buying that good continues to buy it from China. The 5% tariff might take the Chinese price up to $105, but it's still cheaper than importing from Vietnam. And so the importer would be paying $105. The government would be collecting $5 in tariff revenue. But although that costs the importer more, the government is collecting some tariff revenue. So for the United States, the cost is still $100. But now suppose that the tariff goes up to 25%, okay? So the US is now, buying the good from China now makes it $125. Buying from Vietnam is only $120. So you're gonna switch sources of supply. You switch to Vietnam, right? What happens there is that the importer is now paying $120 getting the good from Vietnam. The US government is not collecting anything in tariff revenue, right? Because it's coming in from Vietnam. So this is just a pure cost to the US economy. You're just paying more for the same good because you're sourcing it from a different location. Okay, so that gives you a sense of why these things might entail real efficiency costs. But we've gone out and actually measured these for the United States, and this is what we find. So the first panel tells you what happened in 2018 what these costs are in 2018. And the second panel tells you what we estimate those costs to be if the 25% tariffs continue for another year. So what happened in 2018? We have a monthly cost of tax payments due to the higher tariffs of about $3 billion a month, or about $36 billion on an annual basis. And for every household, they're now paying an extra $282 per household in the United States in tax revenues. Secondly, there's going to be this efficiency loss because we're now shifting imports from China to other sources of supply that are typically more expensive. That amounts to, on an annual basis, about $17 billion, or about $132 per household. So if you sum them together, it's about $414 per household now that are being paid in these tariffs and efficiency losses. But when you raise those tariffs from 10% to 25%, 25% are extremely high tariff rates. We haven't seen rates like that since the 1930s. On a large range of goods. You see two things that happen. The first thing that happens is tariff revenue goes down, right? If you tax something so much that it ceases to be imported, you don't get any tariff revenue. So what we estimate is actually tariff revenues are going to actually be falling as a result of the higher set of tariffs, falling from $36 billion a year down to $26.9 billion a year. Now, the administration is transferring about $16 billion of that revenue to U.S. Soybean farmers. So households that are not soybean farmers are not going to be able to be compensated for that loss. And then the second thing is the efficiency loss goes through the roof. And by our estimates, it goes to about $620 per household. Why? Because supply chains are really moving around to avoid those tariffs. And in my 2 weeks here in Japan, I've spoken to a lot of managers who are telling me about how they are reorienting their supply chains in order to source from countries other than China, and that's all this loss being operationalized. So the total cost per household is about $800. These are likely to be very costly tariffs. Now, second question that you might ask is, okay, but as Lorenzo was talking earlier, you might say, well, I'm bringing jobs at home. Maybe this is going to help American workers. So one thing that's very interesting about the United States is that we've been doing this for a long time in the case of steel. We've been protecting it with the idea of bringing jobs back to the United States. And this chart simply shows the share of U.S. steel imports that have been subject to special tariffs. And you can see that Republicans under Bush and Democrats under Obama have all tried to protect steel in various ways. One of the interesting things about this is that despite all this protection, steel employment has been declining over the whole time period, as is shown in the blue line. It's just been just a secular decline in steel. Interestingly, if you look at steel output, which is the orange line, that's been pretty much flat. So if your view of the world is that foreign competition is costing U.S. jobs, you'd expect both output and employment to fall. But what you actually see is that employment has been falling, but output has been flat. So what is that telling you? It's telling you that we're now able to produce the same level of output with fewer workers. That's automation. It's about technology. It's not really about international trade. I have just a few minutes left. I just want to show you that one of the other things that's happening, as Lorenzo had suggested, is that we're seeing prices jump. This is the price index for major appliances, the consumer price index, which contains washing machines. And you can see that in the United States, washing machine prices were on a 5-year downward trend until February of 2018, when we imposed tariffs on washing machines, and suddenly their prices jumped. An interesting thing that's also happening is that that domestic producers are also raising prices. That is, I'm not talking about importers. I'm talking about the prices of goods made in the United States are going up. This is the price of home appliances, which includes washing machines, producer prices. Those have been rising as well right after the onset of the tariffs. Why? Well, 2 reasons. The first is that these tariffs have been targeting intermediate inputs. So if you're paying more for the steel to make your washing machines, that causes you to raise your prices. And similarly, if you face less competition, that also causes you to raise your prices. Overall estimates, U.S. producer prices are probably up by about 1% as a result of that. So I'm just about out of time. I want to just conclude by saying that we're already seeing some pretty clear evidence that consumers are bearing a lot of costs of these tariffs. Essentially, 10% tariffs get passed on to domestic prices by about completely. So a 10% tariff raises domestic prices by 10%. We're seeing U.S. manufacturers raise their prices. We're seeing some very substantial negative stock market reactions. And there's a lot of uncertainty, and I just want to highlight that bit of uncertainty before I end. Right now, there's talk of extending the tariffs to the remaining $300 billion worth of U.S. imports from China. That could happen. There's also uncertainty about how China is going to respond. So U.S. has massive FDI investments in China. And if this war gets going, it could potentially target those firms. China does not have much in the United States, so that potentially is a cost. There are serious questions about whether automobiles will be targeted. And as Mireya mentioned, there may be some additional costs for being left out of TPP. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much.